In a moment that shocked everyone, a heated live broadcast took an unexpected turn when one of the most powerful figures in the courtroom stormed off, leaving the audience in disbelief. The tension reached a boiling point when secrets, hidden for years, were exposed by none other than one of the world's most controversial figures. The result? A sudden, dramatic exit that no one saw coming. Why did this person walk off? What was so explosive that it caused such an intense reaction? Stay tuned as we dive into this shocking moment that no one expected. You won't believe what happened next. In the world of live television, things rarely go according to plan. What often starts as a controlled, scripted event can quickly spiral into something unexpected. This is particularly true when sensitive information is revealed to the public, often with no prior warning. During a recent live broadcast, a seemingly calm and ordinary conversation between two figures took an unexpected turn. What started as a routine exchange quickly escalated into a shocking moment when one of the figures accidentally exposed personal secrets that were never meant to be shared with the world. The exposure of these secrets was not something that had been planned, nor was it something that had been intended for public consumption. It was a mistake, a slip that came in the heat of the moment during the live broadcast. Secrets that had been carefully guarded for years were now laid bare, and this caused immediate shock both to those involved and to the viewers at home. These revelations were not simply trivial details. They were deeply personal matters that, when exposed, had the potential to cause great embarrassment. However, the moment of revelation was not just impactful for those directly involved, but also for the audience watching. It was a moment that would leave a lasting impression and spark a wave of media attention and speculation. What made the revelation even more intense was the manner in which it occurred. In a live broadcast, the ability to control what is shared is extremely limited. Once something is spoken, especially in front of an audience, there is no turning back. The revelation had been completely unplanned, and there was no chance to smooth over the details or clarify the situation before it had already gone public. The figure who exposed these secrets did so in a way that appeared to be offhand, almost as if it were an afterthought. There was no dramatic build-up or careful preparation. It simply happened, and the consequences were immediate. As soon as the secrets were revealed, the atmosphere in the studio shifted. The mood changed from one of controlled conversation to one of discomfort and uncertainty. Those present could feel the weight of the revelation as it sank in. The shock was palpable, and the individual who had been exposed was visibly stunned by the turn of events. This was not a situation that could be easily dismissed or forgotten. It was a pivotal moment, one that was broadcast live to millions of viewers, and there was no going back. The other figure in the conversation was not prepared for what happened. They had come into the interview with a clear understanding of what would be discussed. They expected a measured, controlled exchange of words, but instead, they were blindsided by the unexpected disclosure. This revelation, coming without warning, left them vulnerable and unprepared to handle the situation. What followed was a reaction that was as swift as it was emotional. The exposed individual could not contain their shock and frustration. In the heat of the moment, they chose to leave the studio entirely, storming off the set in a dramatic display of emotion. This decision was not one made lightly. It was an impulse, a reaction to the unexpected and uncomfortable situation in which they had been placed. The action of storming off the set was not just a sign of frustration, it was a clear signal of how deeply the exposure had affected them. It was as though their control over the situation had been taken away, and in response, they withdrew. The exit left everyone else in the room unsure of what to do next. The cameras continued to roll, but the conversation had effectively ended. The live broadcast had been interrupted by a deeply personal moment of emotional release, and it was unclear how things would proceed from there. The moment had a lasting impact, not just for the individuals involved but also for the viewers who had witnessed it. As the live broadcast continued, it became clear that this was no ordinary interview. It was a turning point, a moment of vulnerability that would define the conversation for days to come. The exposure of such sensitive material created a sense of unease, not only among those directly involved but also for the audience. who had just witnessed something deeply personal unfold in real time. This unexpected revelation forced everyone to reconsider the balance between privacy and public life, raising questions about how much should be shared and whether some things are better left unsaid. In the aftermath of the event, discussions about the ethics of revealing such personal information became the focal point of the media. Some defended the person who had exposed the secrets, arguing that truth should always be told, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Others, however, felt that the exposure was done in poor taste, questioning whether such sensitive information should ever be made public, especially in a setting as public as a live broadcast. The moment quickly became the subject of heated debates across social media and news outlets. People from all walks of life weighed in, offering their opinions on whether the revelation was justified or whether it crossed a line. In many ways, the exposure of these secrets during a live broadcast served as a reminder of the fragility of public personas and the dangers of oversharing. Once something is revealed, especially in such a public way, there is no undoing it. The impact is immediate and far-reaching. What had begun as a simple conversation turned into a pivotal moment of public reckoning, leaving everyone involved to navigate the aftermath of an unexpected and highly charged situation. The live broadcast took an unexpected turn when the figure, who had been caught off guard by the revelation, struggled to manage their emotions. The sudden exposure of deeply personal information, something that had been kept private for years, created an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. The individual had come into the broadcast expecting a routine discussion, one in which they could maintain control over their narrative and public image. But that control was immediately taken away in an instant when their secrets were laid bare for the entire world to see. The emotional reaction that followed was both intense and immediate. The individual, who had been poised and collected moments before, became visibly shaken. Their body language changed from calm and composed to tense and defensive. What had been a conversation about professional matters suddenly turned personal, and the emotional weight of the moment was too much to bear. The emotions of betrayal, frustration, and embarrassment all collided in one overwhelming wave, leaving the individual no choice but to express their distress. In an effort to regain some semblance of control over the situation, they reacted quickly, stepping away from the situation entirely. This decision was not one made after careful consideration, but rather an impulse, a natural, instinctual response to an uncomfortable and unexpected event. The emotional strain of having personal secrets exposed in such a public setting was too much for the individual to handle. The reaction was one of sheer frustration. It was as if the betrayal of their privacy had triggered a chain of emotions that could not be contained. The decision to leave the set to storm off in such a dramatic fashion was a direct result of this emotional overflow. It was a way to escape the situation, a method of retreat when facing the overwhelming discomfort of public exposure. For those watching, the sudden exit only added to the intensity of the moment. The broadcast had already taken an unexpected turn with the exposure of personal information, and now the dramatic departure left the audience in suspense, unsure of what was happening next. The cameras captured the moment, but the figure's reaction was one of vulnerability, not one that could be easily explained or smoothed over in a live setting. The shock on their face was clear as they made their way off the set, leaving the conversation abruptly unfinished. In that instant, the public figure who had been exposed seemed to lose their grip on the situation. They had spent years carefully crafting an image of professionalism, but that carefully constructed persona was shattered. What was meant to be a controlled interaction, one where they could steer the narrative, had suddenly spiraled out of control. This loss of control was not just a professional setback, but a deeply personal one. The exposure had broken down the barriers between their public and private lives, and in that moment, they were unable to regain their composure. The aftermath of this emotional response was just as significant as the initial revelation. The figures storming off the set did not go unnoticed. In fact, it only added fuel to the fire, creating more media buzz and raising even more questions about the situation. News outlets and social media platforms erupted with speculation, about what had really happened behind the scenes. Was this an emotional overreaction, or was it a justified response to a violation of privacy? People questioned whether the figure had been right to react in such a dramatic way, or if there had been a better way to handle the situation. In the hours and days that followed, the figure's emotional reaction became the focal point of discussions. Commentators analyzed the situation from every angle, trying to understand what led to such a dramatic exit. Some viewed the storming off as a sign of weakness, believing that the individual should have stayed and faced the situation head-on. Others, however, empathized with the emotional strain that came with having private matters exposed on such a public stage. The debate about whether the individual's response was justified or not sparked a larger conversation about the pressures faced by those in the public eye. The emotional reaction also highlighted a larger issue, the challenge of maintaining privacy in an increasingly transparent world. With the rise of social media and the 24-hour news cycle, public figures are under constant scrutiny, and even their personal lives are often laid bare. For many, this constant invasion of privacy can feel like an overwhelming burden. The figure who stormed off the set had experienced firsthand the emotional toll that comes with the exposure of private matters. It was a stark reminder of how the line between public and private life has become increasingly blurred in today's media landscape. As the days passed, the figure who had stormed off began to regain some composure and try to address the situation. However, the emotional impact of the exposure could not be undone. The damage had been done, and the person who had been caught off guard by the live revelation would have to find a way to rebuild their public image in the wake of the incident. Despite their attempt to recover, the emotional toll of the experience would likely stay with them for some time. The event served as a reminder of the vulnerability that comes with being in the public eye and the deep emotional costs of having personal secrets exposed for the world to see. The emotional outburst, while controversial, highlighted an important lesson about the importance of respecting boundaries, especially when it comes to the personal lives of others. It also raised questions about how much of a public figure's private life should be open for discussion. In the end, the reaction was a reflection of the deep impact that such revelations can have on a person's emotional well-being, and how public figures, despite their fame or status, are not immune to the vulnerability and pain that comes with the loss of control over their own narrative. In moments of high pressure and public scrutiny, individuals often find themselves pushed to their limits, particularly when unexpected circumstances arise that force them to act quickly. This particular situation was no different. What started as a controlled and planned event, a live broadcast, took a sudden and unexpected turn when sensitive information, previously hidden from the public, was exposed in front of millions of viewers. The individual at the center of the situation had been blindsided by the revelation. These secrets, which had been carefully guarded, were now out in the open, and the individual found themselves completely unprepared to deal with the fallout. What followed was a moment of intense emotional reaction, in an attempt to regain some control over a situation that had spiraled out of hand. The exposed individual made a decision that would only amplify the shock of the moment. The response to the exposure was not one of calm reflection, but of immediate and intense frustration. Without thinking about the long-term consequences, they chose to leave the situation altogether. This decision wasn't premeditated or calculated. It was an instinctive reaction, driven by the overwhelming pressure of having personal details revealed to the public. In that moment, walking off the set seemed like the only way to escape the discomfort and regain some semblance of personal control. This decision to leave wasn't just a physical departure from the set, but a symbolic retreat from the situation. By storming off, the individual demonstrated that they could no longer bear the emotional weight of what had just transpired. The emotional toll of the situation was clear for anyone watching. The person who had been exposed wasn't just dealing with the discomfort of having their secrets made public. They were also contending with the frustration of being caught off guard, of having no time to prepare for such a moment. It was not just a matter of the public's reaction to the exposure, but also how this unexpected event affected them personally. As the individual walked away from the set, it was clear that the revelation had triggered an emotional release. They were no longer the composed and controlled figure they had been moments before. Instead, they were visibly shaken, struggling to come to terms with the unexpected turn of events. The exit from the set was not graceful or measured. It was abrupt, impulsive, and born out of frustration. The individual had been pushed beyond their limit, and in that moment, they sought refuge away from the public eye. The aftermath of the situation was equally dramatic. The broadcast continued, but the atmosphere had completely shifted. The tension that had been created by the sudden exposure was palpable. The people left behind on the set were left to process what had just happened, but there was no escaping the fact that a major moment had just unfolded. The audience, both those watching live and those following the events online, was left in suspense. What had just occurred? What was the individual going to do next? And how would this all play out? This moment also served as a powerful reminder of how quickly situations can spiral out of control, especially in a public setting. It demonstrated the difficulty of managing one's public image and personal life in an environment where everything is under constant scrutiny. No matter how well prepared an individual might feel, one unexpected slip-up can completely change the course of a conversation or event. The emotional response to such a slip-up, especially when it involves the exposure of personal details, can be overwhelming. In this case, the emotional toll of the situation caused the individual to lose their composure, which led to an impulsive decision that only intensified the drama of the moment. What followed was a wave of media attention and public speculation. News outlets quickly picked up on the dramatic exit, and social media exploded with opinions, theories, and reactions. Everyone had their own take on what had just happened. Some sympathized with the individual who had been exposed, understanding the emotional strain that came with such a revelation. Others questioned whether the response was appropriate or whether it had been an overreaction. The public's reaction to such moments of vulnerability is often a mix of judgment and empathy, and in this case, the individual's departure only fueled the debate. The exposure of personal secrets on live television also raised broader questions about privacy, public life, and the ethics of revealing personal information in a public forum. For many public figures, maintaining a clear boundary between their private and public lives can be difficult, especially in today's digital age. The line between what is considered private and what is acceptable to disclose has become increasingly blurred. Moments like these, where personal secrets are thrust into the public eye, serve as a stark reminder of the challenges that come with being in the spotlight. Despite the public's curiosity and the media frenzy, the emotional impact on the individual could not be dismissed. What had begun as a routine interview or broadcast had quickly escalated into an emotional crisis. The decision to leave the set was not just about escaping the situation, but also about processing the raw feelings that came with the sudden loss of control. The person involved had been put in an impossible position, one that required them to navigate a highly charged emotional environment without any time to prepare. In the days following the broadcast, the fallout continued. The emotional weight of the event lingered, and the individual would have to face the consequences of their actions. The media continued to dissect the situation, and public opinion remained divided. Some viewed the storming off as an understandable, emotional response, while others saw it as a sign of weakness. Regardless of the differing opinions, one thing remained clear. The emotional toll of the exposure and the subsequent departure had left a lasting mark on both the individual and the public who witnessed it. In high-stakes environments where the eyes of the world are constantly watching, a single moment can shift the entire narrative. This particular situation unfolded in a very public forum where the stakes were higher than usual. An individual, who had been seated in a setting designed for open discussion, found themselves caught completely off guard. What was supposed to be a controlled conversation suddenly transformed into something far more intense when secrets, previously hidden from the public eye, were suddenly exposed for everyone to see. The exposure wasn't just a casual slip of information. It was a revelation that changed the course of the conversation entirely. What had been intended as a professional exchange took on a very different tone, one that was deeply personal and emotionally charged. The individual, previously calm and collected, now found themselves facing the sudden consequences of having their private matters thrust into the public domain. The emotional impact was immediate and undeniable. As the realization of what had just occurred sank in, the individual began to visibly struggle with the weight of the moment. The reaction was intense, almost as if the air had been sucked out of the room and everything had shifted from professional to deeply personal in an instant. In that split second, the individual was no longer in control. The carefully crafted persona they had built over time began to crumble. What had been a well-prepared appearance was now exposed as vulnerable and flawed. The weight of this realization began to show in their body language. What had been a confident posture turned into a tense, defensive one. The carefully constructed boundaries between their private and professional lives were suddenly gone. In an effort to escape the intense discomfort of being exposed in such a public and unforgiving way, the individual made a split-second decision to leave. The decision to walk off was not one made lightly. It was the result of an overwhelming emotional surge. The person who had just experienced the emotional impact of the revelation needed an immediate escape, and the only way to regain any sense of control was to remove themselves from the situation. It wasn't a decision made with careful consideration. It was a knee-jerk response to the sudden and unexpected emotional turmoil. For anyone watching, it was clear that the individual was trying to regain some semblance of control, though it was difficult to do so in such a chaotic and charged environment. The act of walking off was more than just a physical departure. It was symbolic of the emotional strain the individual was experiencing. The moment the information was exposed, the carefully constructed narrative they had maintained up until that point unraveled. No longer in control of their personal story, they were left to deal with the fallout of a public revelation. The emotional intensity of the situation seemed to demand an immediate response, and in that response, the individual sought refuge from the overwhelming pressure. The decision to leave left a hole in the unfolding narrative. What had been an engaging conversation turned into an unresolved and open-ended moment. The audience, both those present and those watching at home, were left with more questions than answers. What had just happened? Why did the individual leave so abruptly? Was there more to the story than what was being presented? The sense of confusion and uncertainty hung in the air, with the moment unresolved and the tension high. For those observing, the event, the sudden departure, wasn't just a surprise. It was an emotional turning point in the entire broadcast. The focus shifted from the content of the conversation to the person who had just left the set. The absence of the individual was palpable. The questions surrounding their departure became the focal point of the discussion, eclipsing the initial topic entirely. Media outlets and social media platforms were quick to react, with speculation running wild about what had truly transpired. What had caused such an intense reaction? Was this a calculated move, or was it an emotional response to the exposure? The public, now fully invested in the situation, began to pick apart every detail of the event. As the days passed, the event continued to capture the attention of the media. The individual who had walked off was thrust into the spotlight, but not for the reasons they had intended. The focus was no longer on their professional achievements or the discussion that was supposed to take place, but rather on the emotional aftermath of the exposure. The incident prompted discussions about privacy, vulnerability, and the pressures faced by those in the public eye. How much of someone's personal life should be open to the public? How does the constant scrutiny affect their emotional well-being? For the individual at the center of the storm, the fallout was likely significant. The emotional toll of being publicly exposed in such a way is difficult to understate. The decision to walk off was a direct result of that emotional weight. However, the consequences of that action were just as profound. The public's reaction to their departure was swift and intense, and the conversation quickly turned to questions about how to handle such pressure and what to do when private matters are thrust into the public eye. The incident highlighted the vulnerability of public figures, showing how easily the lines between their professional and personal lives can blur. In today's media environment, where privacy is often a luxury, Public figures are constantly at risk of having their private struggles exposed for the world to see. The emotional burden of such exposure can lead to overwhelming moments of distress, as was evident in this case. The emotional surge that led to the decision to leave the set was a powerful reminder of how personal events, when exposed in a public forum, can have far-reaching consequences. In the world of live broadcasts, anything can happen in the blink of an eye. The environment, meant for smooth, planned discussions, can easily become a pressure cooker where emotions run high and unexpected moments take center stage. This was one of those moments where the carefully constructed boundaries between a public persona and personal life were shattered in front of millions. What was supposed to be an organized exchange of ideas quickly devolved into an emotional and dramatic scene when the secrets of a prominent figure were unexpectedly exposed. The exposure was not part of the script. It wasn't something anyone had planned or predicted. In fact, it was a completely unanticipated revelation that caught everyone off guard. The person at the center of the situation had prepared themselves for a professional, controlled conversation, yet they were suddenly thrust into a vulnerable position. Information that had been kept under wraps, details that had been meant for a private space came spilling out in front of an audience that was not just watching, but fully engaged, waiting to see how it would unfold. The impact of such an exposure cannot be overstated. In the span of a few moments, everything changed. The individual, who had been calm and collected up until then, suddenly found themselves in an emotionally charged situation that they were not ready to handle. Their sense of control, built up over years of experience in managing their public image, unraveled quickly. It wasn't just the information that had been exposed, but the shock of the moment that left them struggling to regain composure. The spotlight, which had once been an asset, now felt like an unbearable weight. As the reality of the situation sank in, the emotional strain became apparent. The individual no longer appeared confident or at ease. Their body language shifted, from one of calm professionalism to one of discomfort and agitation. The weight of being caught off guard in front of the public was overwhelming, and it wasn't long before the emotional toll became too much to bear. The reaction that followed wasn't one of careful deliberation or controlled speech. It was an impulsive response driven by the need to escape the overwhelming pressure of the situation. In that moment, the decision to leave the set was made, not out of strategy, but as a direct result of the emotional pressure. It wasn't a calculated move, nor was it a plan to make a statement. It was simply a response to the sudden discomfort of being exposed in such a public, uncontrolled way. The individual, overwhelmed by the situation, felt that walking off the set was the only way to regain some semblance of personal control. It wasn't a proud moment, but one driven by the deep instinctive need to step away from the chaos and seek emotional relief. For those who were watching, the walk-off was jarring. What had been a moment of public discussion turned into an unresolved and tense scene. The sudden departure left the audience in a state of uncertainty. What had just happened? Why had the individual reacted this way? And what would happen next? The focus immediately shifted from the content of the conversation to the unexpected turn of events. People were no longer talking about the topics being discussed, but were now speculating on the motives behind the walk-off. The silence left behind was just as loud as the words that had been exchanged before the individual left. In the aftermath of the event, the media and social media platforms were quick to pick up the story. The unexpected nature of the walk-off, coupled with the exposure of personal details, made for a story that was impossible to ignore. People shared their opinions and began to speculate about the reasons behind the emotional reaction. Some saw the walk-off as an understandable emotional response to being blindsided, while others viewed it as a sign of weakness. The person at the center of the event became the topic of intense public scrutiny, but much of the focus was on their reaction rather than the content of the conversation. For the individual involved, the emotional fallout of the exposure and subsequent walk-off was likely immense. Being thrust into the public eye in such a vulnerable state is never easy, and the pressure of dealing with both the public's judgment and the personal toll of the situation would have been significant. The walk-off may have temporarily provided a sense of escape. But it also left the individual open to even more intense scrutiny. People began to question their ability to handle the pressures of public life, wondering if the emotional response was a sign of someone who was not prepared for the rigors of being constantly under the microscope. This entire scenario highlighted the delicate balance that public figures must maintain between their personal lives and their public personas. What was once private became very public in an instant, and the emotional impact of such a shift is profound. The lines between professional and personal become increasingly difficult to draw when everything is broadcasted live, and the stakes of such revelations are high. It's a reminder of how fragile the balance can be, and how quickly a situation can spiral when the private becomes public. What followed was a period of intense reflection. The individual involved likely had to come to terms with the emotional fallout, not just from the exposure but from their response to it. The decision to walk off, made in a moment of emotional overwhelm, would have lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The emotional toll of such a public event can stay with a person, especially when they feel that their personal life has been compromised. For many public figures, dealing with such moments requires a level of resilience, but in this case, the emotional strain was too much to ignore. It was a powerful reminder of how being under constant public scrutiny can have a profound effect on one's ability to navigate difficult situations, both personally and professionally.